Hey, as you're turning to Matthew 5, you know that we're continuing a series in the Sermon on the Mount. So if you haven't been with us the last couple of weeks, let me catch you up really quick. We've said that from now until basically to the end of the year, we're going to work through what is the longest discourse of Jesus in his ministry recorded in the Scriptures. 111 verses, Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7, what is well known in our culture as the Sermon on the Mount. Begins with Jesus, who has started his ministry, gained some popularity, crowds kind of gathering around, and he just goes up onto the side of a mountain and sits down and he begins to teach. And then from there, Matthew records kind of the highlights of what he teaches over this time that we describe in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. And so we said that thematically what we're going to do is kind of take it in some broad strokes. Tempted we were to sort of really spend some time in each specific verse and kind of unfold and develop sort of the concepts that he's putting there. For your sake, I knew that that would mean that I'll be preaching about that for the next 3 years. So we decided instead we'd sort of take a larger thematic view, take some chunks and pieces together, and use that as an opportunity for us to kind of guide through Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, and in doing so, point out some of the major points of emphasis, which we said is really an entire sermon built on or founded upon the fact that Jesus is describing what it looks like to live as a citizen of the kingdom of heaven. To not live in perspective as this world being all there is, or this world being even most important to us, but now in anticipating eternity that we would live as citizens of the kingdom. And we said the important distinction with that then is that we also don't see it as a how-to manual in order to get into that kingdom, but rather as in response to the grace of God in Jesus, what it looks like to live as a citizen of that kingdom. And so we began last week with this well-known passage called the Beatitudes, where Jesus begins to just list who is blessed or blessed in this life, who it is that ultimately has the blessing of the kingdom of heaven. And he says it's those who are poor in spirit, those who are mourning, those who are meek or gentle, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, are of pure heart and are merciful, and those who are the peacemakers. And in all of these things, he kind of gives this imagery of what we ought to look like as kingdom citizens, but also ties it back over and over again to what it looks like to be a kingdom citizen because of him. Right? It's in poor spirit, us having no goodness innate to ourselves, but rather that he has made us right, that we experience the kingdom. It's in the mourning of our sin and in the meekness, the humble, gentle state of our being that we can receive his mercy and his grace, that he puts that pure heart in us, that he is the one who provides the righteousness that we hunger and thirst for, that he's the one who makes peace for us, that between the enmity of us and God the Father, peace is brought by Jesus. And so all of it kind of points back to the gospel. And then what we read last week but didn't deal with at all becomes this really, what I'm going to say is kind of a fascinating, almost awkward segue between what he's going to say next, but still fills out the Beatitudes. Because poor in spirit, receiving mercy, being a peacemaker, you just kind of see these connecting to the gospel. And then he says this: blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. In fact, he doesn't even leave it there. He says you ought to rejoice in that and be glad. Let's just think about this for a moment for a couple reasons. One, I don't think it makes worldly sense to be glad or rejoicing in persecution. Amen? Can we just be honest about that? In this world, that doesn't make sense. Two, and where I want to really kind of spend a little bit of time today, it really does not make sense that we would be persecuted for the sake of righteousness if what is the prevailing philosophy of this world is that generally people are pretty good. Right? Anybody heard that at some point in their life, that generally speaking, people are relatively good? Heard that before? Hands stuck down? Baptists? All right. Charismatics? Come on. All right. So in this, right, you've heard before that people are generally good. Well, if that's true, why would anybody be persecuted for the sake of righteousness? Right? Now one of the, and this is a little bit of precursor. You need to hear this. Some of you really need to hear this in order to understand the next piece of this. But one of the things that happens in the church is a lot of times believers claim that they're being persecuted, and then they leave out that little prepositional phrase, for the sake of righteousness. And so you go, well, I'm just being persecuted. It's actually your sinful behavior that people are resisting. That's not persecution. That's you experiencing some earthly consequence to sinful behavior. And yet what Jesus points out is that that's not always the case. Sometimes you do what is right, you do what is righteous, you care for others, you look to others first, you demonstrate the attributes of Christ, and in doing so, you still face opposition. And if you can't believe that, know that ultimately the foundation of Christianity is that God was incarnate, became a man in Christ, and lived 33 years without sin. Ever. Not once. Didn't do it. And in his perfect fullness of grace and truth, in his perfect fullness of living outside of sin, he was so kind, so loving, so gracious, so honest, so caring for everyone he interacted with, that after just 3 years of public ministry, they would put him on a cross with crowds claiming and yelling, "Crucify him." Right? The fullness of, the model of, the example of perfect righteousness is one who died a criminal's death. That at some point in life, you're persecuted for the sake of righteousness. And so the question becomes, why would such a thing happen? Why would we ever have to worry about experiencing pain when we're doing right? In fact, I would say that the prevailing philosophy of our world is that if you do the right things, you will get the best things. And those who do the wrong things deserve whatever they have coming to them. Amen? That kind of what the world teaches? Right? In fact, it's a really comfortable teaching when everything's going well in your life, because you can kind of go, that's kind of nice. Right? If I get this good thing happening to me, it's because I deserve it. Right? And if that person doesn't get a good thing, it's because they deserve it. However, it flies in the face of all biblical teaching. Not only that, I think one of the things that we have maybe lost a little bit culturally that I want to plead with you, really kind of build a basis for it and make it the foundation of what Jesus is going to say next, which we'll look at the second half of today, is the needed, essential, baseline truth that people are not generally good, but rather that people are generally corrupt, dark, and evil. That we're generally speaking, that the world, generally speaking, is corrupt, dark, and evil, and it's because of us. It's because of people. Because of human beings that have sinful, evil, not good desires, and because they act on them. Now, the thing is, as we progress as a culture, it's oftentimes you find us progressing away from that being an essential truth. In fact, it's not a new thing. So, unless you're tempted to think that that's kind of a new idea in our culture, know that that's something that has kind of continued on throughout history. And I'm going to nerd out on you historically a little bit. You can save it for a dinner party if you want, or you can just deal with it. In this, what we've seen throughout the history of humanity, you go study and find that generally speaking, you're going to find a lot of people who are going to go, the problems of this world exist in just a few, and generally speaking and broadly speaking, we're all really great. There's a guy, a Frenchman, in the mid-18th century, around 1750, named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He's got the French spelling, so you pronounce that however you want. But Rousseau comes out of the camp of a philosopher named Voltaire. He's a political philosopher who essentially begins to coin this idea, right? The idea is that, in general, everybody's great. In fact, the problem in humanity is that long ago, somebody somewhere took some stakes and put them in the ground and said, this land is my land, and that other people didn't have enough mind to just pull those stakes up and go, no, this land belongs to everybody, and there is no singular possession, and that if we could just get back to that, and if we just got rid of the social constructs that were around us, the general good nature of mankind would take over and people would do really well again. And that it was simply a select few who decided that they would claim things as their own that ultimately ruined it for everybody else, right? I don't know, maybe he didn't have kids, because all I have to do, right, is I just leave my 3 kids in the basement for 7 seconds with one toy, right? No stakes, right? This is everybody's toy. And I think your essential goodness will allow you to share this and play with it well, right? Come on, guys, right? Like, here's the thing that's crazy. The Europeans, in particular, those who are of French philosophy around 1750, really begin to latch onto this philosophy as now, some couple hundred years later, you find in every society everywhere, a whole lot of people who generally want to believe this is the case, that people are really good, and it's just a few people that have really caused all of the problems that exist in the world, not the bulk of humanity. And in this, they begin to kind of take this and imply this over and over again, all the while believing that if they could just educate people, if they could just grow people, if they could just make people aware enough of how great they really are, that eventually all of the problems in this world would find themselves eradicated and move forward. Here's what happens. In the 1790s, what begins is known as the French Revolution. The French begin to throw out the absolute monarchy, and they replace it with constitutions that they write primarily based on Rousseau's teaching. Shortly after that, about a year later, this is 1791, so about 1793, begins in France what is known as the Reign of Terror. If you know a little bit about your history, here's essentially what the Reign of Terror is, exactly what it says. They take a guillotine and they kill tens of thousands of people who resist their philosophy in the name of what is the common good of bringing society back to its inherently good roots. Sound nuts? Sounds nuts. If it doesn't, let me continue to plead with you. Today, you fast forward 240 years. Here's what you see. All around the world, as educated, as able to communicate as we've ever been, as globalized as the world has ever been, as knowledgeable in terms of access to content as the world has ever been, you find a deep, dark, corrupted, evil nature of humanity. At present, in Afghanistan, war continues since 1978. So if you measure what is known as a war or conflict in our culture, currently, still at war in Afghanistan. Since 1978, 1.2 million people murdered as part of war. 41,000 people in 2019. In Mexico, since 2006, in regards to the drug war and cartels running rampant, 115,000 people dying because of it. 17,000 people this year. In Syria, since 2011, 600,000 deaths due to civil war. 10,000 this year. In Yemen, 80,000 deaths since 2011 in civil war. 21,000 this year. This year, 36 million people will die from hunger. Over 1 billion will suffer from it. Hundreds and hundreds of millions of people without access to clean water, without access to sanitation. As educated, knowledgeable, globalized, capable of knowing these things as perhaps we've ever been historically, and yet what you find is a world that is full of corruption, full of evil, full of darkness, and it's at the hands of human beings. Right? Now, we're not going to end here, right? You're like, that is super depressing and awful. Here's what the question becomes. What do you do with that? You, believer? Us, Christians? What's the response to that? Here's one that I think is well emotionally drawn to, that we have this kind of tendency to want to hold on to, is that you could just hide from it. Right? You can recluse. You could just run away. You could go and get to the most rural place that we could possibly imagine, Lafayette County, right? That gets more rural than this, I promise. And in it, you could go find a place where you don't have to talk to any other people. You don't have to engage with any part of the culture around us. You can just kind of keep yourselves away from all of the world's evil and believe that you on your own are not the same as the rest of the evil world. And if you just hide from it enough, maybe you can make it through this life. Right? That's an option. It's an option that people grab onto naturally often. The problem is that we then in it discount the own heart condition of our evil that still exists outside of Christ. You could go to war with it, right? You could decide that you want to champion reform and change and be someone who's an advocate for some social cause or some political cause, believing that it will ultimately change the nature of institutions. Maybe you can change some laws that would ultimately fix some of this evil. And yet what you find is, we talked about it in Sunday school for this morning for those who are a part of it, is that you will make different laws and find the same evil that prevails even amongst changes in legislation, that there's just new ways that evil erodes. You plug a hole in a dam one spot and it pops out from another spot. Here's what Jesus says about it. In fact, this is why Jesus ends the Beatitudes with, "Blessed are you who are persecuted, insulted, and reviled because of me, that you can rejoice and be glad." Because here's what you, believer, are meant to do in the midst of a corrupt, a dark, and a broken world. Verse 13, you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. Then he says this, you are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on the lampstand. And it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Here's Jesus' answer to the question, what do you do with a corrupted and dark world? Do you hide? Do you just try to adapt? Do you just try to fit yourself in? Do you fight against it with everything you are? He calls us two things. He says, you ought to be salt and you ought to be light. Salt as the preservative of corruption, and light as the thing that stays off darkness. Here's how it worked. In ancient cultures, there was almost no refrigeration. And so if you had something that you wanted to keep from spoiling, you would use salt. You'd rub it into, I don't have to teach a lot of you, rub it into meat and it would cure it, it would preserve, it would keep your food oftentimes from corrupting, from going bad. And so Jesus looks at it and uses this as an illustration for us to be the people who would go into the world and stay off corruption. In fact, in this culture, salt was so important that the Romans, those who were chief amongst the government and officials at that time, soldiers would be paid in salt. That salt found immense value in and amongst that time, and the value was primary that it would be a preservative for the most basic of needs, which was that you could eat. And so in this, Jesus looks at it and says, you are the salt of the earth. You are the one that is meant to stop the corruption in this earth, that you would be the one that puts a stay to the continuing nature of deterioration and badness. Now, not only that, but you might read this and see this individually as you. This is kind of a side point, but I think it's worth pointing out. In the English language, you can be singular or plural. It can mean a couple people or it can mean a lot of people. Some of you incorrectly say yous. Some of you incorrectly say y'all. I'm not going to look at any of you in particular, but in it, you, that's a response to the fact that you could mean one person or it could mean a whole bunch of people. Jesus uses this in this context, you plural, as in you who are citizens of the kingdom. And not only is it plural, but it's emphatic, pointing out you, and the way you would read it then is you and you alone, church. You and you alone, citizens of the kingdom of heaven, are the salt of the earth. Now, the reason I point that out is because there's only a few of them at this point in time. Because it would have been an absurd thought to think that amongst all of the brokenness, all of the corruption, all of the deterioration in the world, that Jesus, sitting on one mountain in one city with one crowd of followers, is looking at them and going, you will be the people that change the nature of the world, that you will stop, that you will slow the decay of society, that you would be the salt of the earth. And yet, here's what happens. Christ dies. 3 days later, he's resurrected. A few weeks after that, the day of Pentecost happens in Jerusalem, and from 120 people in an upper room, the church begins. If you follow a little bit of history, the church explodes throughout Jerusalem, to Judea, to Samaria, to the remotest parts of the earth. It begins to take over the Roman Empire. One of the things that's so fascinating about it is the reason that it grows so quickly and with such force is in the Roman Empire, a lot of things happen to be going wrong, and Christians happen to be completely disengaged with the wrongdoing and completely engaged with holy and righteous lives, honoring God. And it starts to draw people in. These people aren't concerned about the social conditions. These people aren't concerned about plagues. These people aren't concerned about their persecution. These people just seem like they want to honor Jesus. And it begins to change the nature of the Roman Empire. Not only that, but as time continues, it begins to move to the remotest parts of the globe. And if you follow the last 2,000 years of history, what you find is anywhere Christianity arrives, it begins to change, migrate, and influence culture into healthier means. Let me give you an example. You remember I talked about France in 1790. France is kind of ending colonialism, getting away from absolute monarchs, and they do so in this reign of terror, French Revolution. Napoleon comes on the scene, all of these kind of bloody and broken and nasty things. Well, France isn't the only nation at that time that has an absolute monarch. Right? I mean, you've been to 7th grade history, you know that all of Europe kind of exists with these single powers that in their kind of massive influence are extending things all across the globe. Well, Great Britain, among them, is perhaps first and foremost. Well, something different happens in Great Britain. Around the time of Rousseau saying people are generally good, they just need less structure, less society, and they'll be better, are in England a couple of guys amongst some others by the name of George Whitefield and John Wesley. You might have heard of them. They found what is now known as the Methodist movement or the Methodist Church. They both begin in England. In fact, John and his brother Charles and George are part of the same club at Oxford University. They begin to travel out preaching throughout the English countryside. Not only are they preaching, but they preach to tens of thousands of people at a time. John Wesley in his life, it was said, delivered more than 250,000 sermons. That's a lot, right? That's a lot. I mean, all he did was from town to town, on horse, get off, preach to whoever would listen, go to the next place and do the same thing. Day in and day out for years, speaking about the redeeming work of Jesus Christ. Now, here's what happens in the 1750s in Great Britain. People come to know Christ. It's historically known as the Great Awakening. There's mass revival and salvation across the country. People come to know Christ. Not only that, but following coming to know Christ, they begin to open orphanages. They begin to open schools. They begin to care for the poor and the sick and the dying. Hospitals and charities begin to birth out of it. And at the end of the 18th century, they get to a point where rather than a violent overthrow of the monarchy, the British government begins to peacefully transition to a government of the people that is desiring to see freedom and righteousness reign in the place of oppression. It inspires the end of the slave trade. It inspires change happening for the sake of righteousness. It begins to look like the salt of the earth changing a corrupt and broken nature into one that slows, into one that evidences some pieces of righteousness, evidences some pieces of God's grace, and it changes the way that we function as a society. That Jesus looks at it and says, it's not all of you, but rather just a few of you as the salt of the earth going out into this world, being the people that would look at a broken and corrupted and dark place around you and desiring not to fight against it, desiring not to hide from it, but desiring to press into it. Right? Perhaps it's too much of a literal piece of the analogy, but if you want to cure something with salt, what do? You rub it in. That you would go and rub yourselves into stopping the evil in the way that you might live. He says, you are the salt of the earth. Then he warns, before we get into the light of the world, let's just note this. He warns that the salt could lose its taste. Now, if you're like an Iron Chef person, you know that salt doesn't actually lose its taste. What is he even talking about? How could its saltiness be restored? Well, here's what he meant. What would happen because of the value of salt in that time, in that culture, was if you could be paid in salt, you would see this as a pretty worthwhile commodity. And so, at times, those who were a little less integritous or those who were less honest would take salt and they would take some substance that wasn't worth as much but looked like salt, perhaps sugar, for example, or something of that nature, and they would mix it together because you could weigh now what was salt, and through its dilution, it would weigh more and it'd be worth more money, even though that salt didn't have the same potency, didn't have the same taste that it once had, right? We do a homeschool group here on Fridays, and we taught this a couple weeks ago, and here's the example. So if you got kids or grandkids, this is free, you can use this. We took a bunch of sugar packets, right, and I lined up a few kids, and we ripped the tops off of all the sugar packets, and then I dump one out, and I fill it with salt. And then you hand it to them, right? And you go, okay, on 3, maybe you do it with somebody else's kids, because even the winners are eating an entire packet of sugar. So, or send the kids somewhere else right after that. I don't know. But then you look and you try to decide what kid grabbed the salt, right? Like salt or sugar, and in it there's a great deal of potency. Now, here's the thing: if you were to dilute salt, it begins to lose that potent taste. It does not take much salt to make Ryan Gill want to throw up. He was the unlucky one at that point in time. It looked like he was going to die for a couple minutes there. Right? In that, it doesn't take that much. But you begin to dilute it, and it no longer has its value. Here's what Jesus is getting at when he says the salt could lose its taste. He says that if you stop being one who is interested in influencing the world for Christ, and you start becoming one that just wants to fit in and be like the world, if you start to change your hunger and thirst for righteousness and replace it with a desire to live just like everyone else has lived, you begin to lose your potency. You begin to be looked upon as one who has no ability to stay the corruption of the world. You begin to be looked upon as someone who's not persecuted for the sake of righteousness, who just looks like another hypocritical Christian. That if you live a lifestyle that's inconsistent with what you profess, that you become like salt that has no taste, that becomes like salt that is not potent. His warning is that if we're meant to be the salt of the earth, it connects to and it's dependent on our need to hunger and thirst for righteousness. It's dependent on our need to be people of mercy. It's dependent on our need to be people who are of pure heart and desiring to make peace. It's dependent on our righteousness, that we would live lives following Christ. So what do you do with the darkness of this world? Well, first you press in, desire to be those who would make a difference, desire to be those who would make change. He says, not only are you salt of the earth, but also you are the light of the world. That Jesus is going to ultimately in John say that he is indeed the light of the world. And so as the lights of the world ourselves, it means that those of us who know Christ are reflecting the glory of God in Jesus Christ to the world. But then he says this, no one, after lighting a lamp, would put it under a basket. That many Christians live these lives of kind of hidden Christianity. Right? I remember when I was in high school, I had a teacher who was asked in a kind of moment of class about where he went to church, and his response was this. He said, "I believe religion is very important, and I don't think you should ever talk to anybody about it." Well, it can't be that important, right? If you don't want to talk to anybody about it. But think about how representative that is of the society we live in, right? That is number one, probably primary viewpoint in our culture today is that it's cool if you want to worship God, just do it on your own and do it in your own way and don't tell me about it. Right? Jesus is warning that there's a great danger with that. In fact, he's warning that no one in their right mind who possesses the light of the world would, in hiding, put it under a basket to keep it from reaching anybody, but rather that they would set it on a lampstand where it would give light to all the house, that they would be like a city set on a hill, that it would be the desire of us as believers to have our lives know and show the glory of God in Jesus Christ. Now, here's the last thing I want to challenge you with and encourage you with, because here's what a lot of times I feel like I tend to feel like. And I think this is a shared feeling. Yeah, but it's just so hard. There used to be a time, in fact, I'm younger than a lot of you, but I know that this is kind of the prevailing mentality, right? There used to be a time when it was easier. Used to be a time when everybody was in church. Used to be a time when you could talk openly about Christ. There used to be a time when people bring their Bibles to school. There used to be a time where it was more acceptable in our culture. Used to be. Amen? Here's the thing about light, though. It is most noticeable against a dark backdrop. Finish with a story, and then we'll take the Lord's Supper. There's a missionary, the name of Corrie Ten Boom. Some of you know her story. She grew up 1930s near Germany under Nazi regime. Her and her sister Betsy, as Christians, were compelled by a Jewish, well-dressed Jewish woman who arrived at their door looking for help. Knew that they risked their very own lives by helping, and began to, as the light of the world in response to what Christ was doing, choose to do so anyways. In fact, person after person, scores of people, they estimate hundreds of Jews protected, hidden, and kept well by their ministry. Thing is, it ended up costing them. It was found out about in Nazi Germany, and they were taken and put into a concentration camp. Abused and mistreated there. Betsy, her sister, was actually killed in part of this concentration camp. And Corrie, though she was released, it was found out that it was only because of a clerical error, and the group that she was a part of was sent to the gas chamber the very next week. Shouldn't have escaped with her life. Here's what happened amongst many things, and I'd encourage you. You want to look for something inspiring and encouraging to read. You go read some of her works. But in and amongst this, the thing that was so striking to me is 1946, following the war, she returns to Germany. She returned to meet with 2 German officers working in the concentration camp where she was. 2 of them in particular that had been notably brutal to her sister Betsy. And she returned not to exact justice, but to forgive them. And it sparks this change in her. It goes on to influence thousands and thousands of people with the rest of her life. She spends the rest of her life traveling, speaking about the grace of God, looking at the glory of God in her life and through these miserable things. And the thing that I was just compelled by and continue to think about is, had there not been any trials, had there not been any concentration camp, had there not been any persecution, had there not been any pain, perhaps she's just another name. Perhaps you don't know anything about her. But her story, amongst many, many, many others, is one that reminds us of what Jesus is noting. That in the midst of a world, and man, I feel like we experience this more and more every single day in our culture. In the midst of what seems like a sliding and regressing and broken nature of the things that are around us, light shines brightest in the dark. And so he looks at those sitting on a mountainside, and by extension, he looks at you and I. He says, listen, if you are citizens of my kingdom, if you know me, you are meant to be salt, pressing into this world in your preservative, in your righteousness, in your holiness, bringing it to the corruption. And you're meant to be light, shining into the darkness, desiring to make my name known, desiring to share my love, desiring to share my grace, desiring to be my representatives of this world set on a hill, not hidden. I want to pray for us. I want to take the Lord's Supper together, rejoicing as a people who know the Lord Jesus. Know that for the sake of our righteousness, he came. For the sake of making us righteous, he died. And for the sake of letting us go and be righteous in the world, taking that righteousness out as the salt and light of this world, he resurrected from the dead and he commissioned you and I. So as our young people come and sit, I want to pray together, and then I want to, in remembrance of him, challenge you to take the Lord's Supper thinking about how it will press us out as a people that represent his name.